For 150 years, one of the most famous ancient civilizations in North America was described, in textbooks and documentaries and museum exhibits, as a community of peaceful farmers, democratic, egalitarian, people who lived in harmony with the land and with each other, and who, for reasons unknown, simply vanished around 1200 AD. That was the story in classrooms. That was the story on interpretive signs in national parks. That was the story told to generations of school children. The problem is that the bones contradicted every part of it, and nobody had read the bones. The bones had been sitting in museum drawers since the 1890s, collected from the canyon and shipped east, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. When ancient DNA sequencing finally caught up to the question in the 2010s, the results came back, and they did not gently revise the textbook version. They dismantled it. This is what the bones actually said. Start with the place itself. Chaco Canyon is a shallow cut of sandstone approximately 9 miles long in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico. No river of any consequence runs through it. No fertile valley surrounds it. Standing in it today, there is no obvious reason why anyone would build anything here at all. And yet, between approximately 800 and 1130 AD, it became the political and ceremonial center of a civilization that stretched across 90,000 square miles, an area larger than the island of Ireland. They built great houses, more than a dozen of them, rising multiple stories from the canyon floor. Pueblo Bonito alone contained approximately 650 rooms. The construction of those great houses required over 240,000 individual timber beams. Every one of them hauled from forests more than 50 miles away because the canyon itself had none. They connected it all with roads, at least 400 miles of them, some 30 feet wide, running in perfectly straight lines across the desert. These roads climbed cliffs rather than rooting around them. That is not logistics. That is a statement about who built them and what they believed they deserved. Inside Pueblo Bonito, archaeologists found 35 scarlet macaw skeletons, 30 of them from a single great house. They found approximately 24 copper bells, marine shell ornaments in the thousands, cacao residue in ceramic cylinder jars, the first confirmed use of chocolate north of the Mexican border, dated between approximately 1000 and 1125 AD. On a sandstone formation called Fajada Butte, a spiral petroglyph marks the summer solstice to within minutes, using 3 stone slabs to cast daggers of light across the carved rock face at exactly the right moment each year. This was not a scattering of villages. This was something organized, something precise, something built by people who understood astronomy, engineering, and the coordination of enormous human labor across generations. For most of 150 years, archaeologists told one story about the people who built all of this. It was a reassuring story, and it was almost entirely wrong. The civilization that built all of that was given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi. It is a word that carries uncomfortable connotations, which is why most contemporary archaeologists now prefer Ancestral Puebloans. But for most of the last 150 years, Anasazi was the name attached to the mystery. And the mystery had a very tidy shape. A civilization rose, a civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. That was the story in museums. That was the story in documentaries. That was the story taught to generations of school children across the 20th century. A peaceful farming people, democratic, egalitarian, nearly utopian. People who worshiped the sun and the corn and the seasons, who lived without kings and without hierarchy, and who, for reasons that remained frustratingly unclear, simply walked away from everything they had built around 1200 AD and faded into the desert. The problem is that this story was built before anyone could read the bones. The egalitarian narrative was constructed from pottery fragments, architectural analysis, and the oral traditions of descendant communities. When those communities were consulted at all, it was a story assembled in the absence of the most important evidence. Because the bones themselves, the actual biological record of who these people were, where they came from, and how power moved among them, had been sitting in museum drawers for over a century. Many of them at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, shipped east after excavations in the 1890s, cataloged and stored and left largely unread. Pre-DNA archaeology had no tools to interrogate what those bones actually contained. So archaeologists worked with what they had, and what they had produced a story that was reassuring, teachable, and wrong. Then, in 2010, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that allowed researchers to extract readable genetic material from Chacoan skeletal remains. The first study to do this produced a finding that should have ended the peaceful egalitarian narrative on its own. In February of 2017, a study was published in the journal Nature Communications. The lead researcher was Douglas J. Kennett, professor of anthropology at Penn State University. The results were corroborated by David Reich's laboratory at Harvard Medical School. And what they found inside a 2-meter square room in the heart of Pueblo Bonito ended a century of speculation in a single paper. The room was called Room 33. It had been excavated in 1896 as part of an American Museum of Natural History expedition. Archaeologists had known since then that the people buried inside it were not ordinary. The room sat within the initial construction phase of Pueblo Bonito, built in the 9th century at the very beginning of Chaco's rise. It contained 14 individuals. The burial goods surrounding them were unlike anything found elsewhere in the ancestral Puebloan world. Kennett's team selected 9 of those 14 individuals for ancient DNA analysis, based on the quality of DNA preservation in each set of remains. When the mitochondrial genomes came back from sequencing, every researcher on the team checked the results twice. All 9 individuals shared an identical mitochondrial genome sequence, belonging to a haplogroup designated B2Y1. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother. Identical mitochondrial genomes across 9 individuals from the same burial chamber means one thing: a single matrilineal descent group. One family line passed through mothers generation after generation, buried in the same room at the center of the same great house. To confirm the relationship structure, the team ran nuclear genome analysis on the 6 samples with the highest DNA preservation. The results confirmed direct biological relationships: mother to daughter, grandmother to grandson. AMS radiocarbon dating then established the timeline. The lineage persisted from approximately 800 to 1130 AD. 330 years, the entire span of Chaco's rise and dominance, controlled by a single kinship group. Kennett's words. For the first time, we are saying that one kinship group controlled Pueblo Bonito for more than 300 years. This is the best evidence of a social hierarchy in the ancient Southwest. The burial goods surrounding these 9 individuals told the same story in a different language. Approximately 11,000 pieces of turquoise, conch shell trumpets carried from the Pacific coast, elaborately woven reed mats. These were not the graves of equal citizens in a leaderless farming community. These were the tombs of a dynasty. A kinship group that controlled the most powerful great house in the canyon for 330 years, buried with 11,000 pieces of turquoise, was not a democratic farming community. But the dynasty itself was not the strangest finding, because the DNA held a second signal, and this one did not belong in the American Southwest at all. The dynasty in room 33 was the first demolition, but the researchers were not finished with the DNA. When they compared the broader Chacoan genetic profile to the surrounding ancestral Puebloan populations of the ancient Southwest, something did not align. The hunter-gatherer and early farming lineages that had lived in the desert for thousands of years before Chaco rose were detectable in skeletal samples across the Four Corners region. That baseline was consistent, expected, readable. But at Chaco Canyon itself, and specifically among the elite burials, there were additional genetic signals that did not match the surrounding populations, signals that had no precedent in the regional baseline at all. The non-local signal did not appear evenly across the Chacoan population. It concentrated in one place: the elite burial contexts. The people at the top of whatever hierarchy had organized this civilization carried a genetic signature that the people around them did not share. And the timing of that signal was precise. It aligned with the period when Chaco was transforming from a scattering of pit house villages into a coordinated ceremonial center, approximately the late 9th century. Something had arrived at Chaco around 900 AD. Whatever it was had embedded itself directly into the highest status spaces of the most powerful great house in the canyon. The genetic signal pointed south. Researchers then looked for material culture that could confirm what the DNA was suggesting. They did not have to look long. Between 900 and 1200 AD, a window confirmed by direct radiocarbon dating. The goods flowing into Chaco Canyon from the south were extraordinary. Scarlet macaws, copper bells from West Mexico, cacao from the tropical lowlands, marine shells from the Gulf of California. In 2018, a DNA study of the macaw remains themselves, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by George and colleagues, added another layer. The scarlet macaws at Chaco Canyon were not wild-caught birds acquired through long-distance trade. DNA analysis showed they were locally bred, from a founding breeding stock traceable to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Every macaw tested from Chaco and the surrounding Mimbres region belonged to a single mitochondrial haplogroup. All radiocarbon dated between 900 and 1200 AD. The genetic trail pointed south. The material trail pointed south. But the researchers needed physical evidence that an actual person, not just goods, had made the journey north. They found it in an artifact that should not exist anywhere in the American Southwest. The evidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, piece by piece, decade by decade, in the way that the most unsettling discoveries always do. Each item, taken alone, could be explained away. Together, they could not. The first piece was a ball court. At Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chacoan world in what is now Arizona, archaeologists found a ball court. Not a regional approximation of one, not a local structure that vaguely resembled one. An actual Mesoamerican-style ball court, matching the architectural type used for ritual games across the Valley of Mexico for over 1,000 years. No other ball courts of this tradition exist anywhere in the American Southwest. There is no local architectural lineage that could have produced it. No evolutionary path that leads from southwestern building traditions to a Mesoamerican ball court. It was imported whole from a world 1,000 miles away. The second piece was a colonnade. At Chetro Kettle, one of the great houses inside Chaco Canyon itself, a row of columns was built along a ceremonial space, arranged in the style of Mesoamerican temple architecture. No building tradition anywhere in the surrounding Southwest produced colonnades. This was not a convergent design. It was a signature. And at some point later in Quetzalcoatl's history, someone filled those columns in, as if the signature had become uncomfortable, as if someone wanted it gone. The third piece was chocolate. Chemical analysis of ceramic cylinder jar fragments from Pueblo Bonito confirmed the presence of theobromine, the biomarker for cacao. The nearest cacao cultivation in the ancient world was in central Mexico, in regions including northern Veracruz and Colima. The cylinder jars themselves closely resemble Mesoamerican vessels used specifically for the ritual preparation and consumption of chocolate drinks. Someone at Pueblo Bonito was not just receiving cacao as a trade good. They were using it in the correct vessels, in the correct ceremonial context, in the correct Mesoamerican way. The fourth piece was a tooth, a single tooth found among the elite burials at Pueblo Bonito, shaped and chipped in a pattern of deliberate dental modification, a practice common across Mesoamerica, documented in the archaeological record across the Valley of Mexico and beyond, and found nowhere north of Mexico. Not in the Southwest, not in the Great Basin, not in the Rocky Mountains or the Great Plains. This style of dental modification was not a regional custom that spread north through trade. It was carried in the mouth of a person who had been born and raised in Mesoamerica. A ball court with no regional precedent, a colonnade that was later concealed. Cacao from central Mexico in vessels that match Mesoamerican ritual containers. And one tooth, shaped in a style that existed only 1,000 miles to the south. The picture assembles itself, and it leads somewhere most researchers in the 20th century refused to follow. Where the genetic and material evidence pointed, one physical anthropologist had already been looking for 30 years. And for 30 years, almost nobody wanted to hear what he was finding. His name was Christy G. Turner II, Regents Professor of Anthropology at Arizona State University. He had begun studying ancestral Puebloan skeletal remains in the 1960s, and he brought to that work something most of his colleagues lacked: a background as a forensic consultant working with law enforcement. Turner knew what human bones looked like when they had been treated gently after death, and he knew what they looked like when they had been treated as something else entirely. Over approximately 3 decades, Turner and his wife Jacqueline examined bones from more than 76 sites across New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. What they found did not fit the peaceful farmer narrative. It did not fit any narrative that the field was comfortable publishing. So Turner built a checklist, a set of 6 perimortem taphonomic criteria that had to be present before he would conclude that a skeletal assemblage showed evidence of cannibalism. Not violence, not ritual mutilation, actual processing of a human body as food. The first criterion was perimortem cut marks, made by stone tools at the specific joint endpoints, where tendons attach muscle to bone. The signature of deliberate defleshing. The second was intentional bone breakage. Fracture patterns consistent with breaking fresh bone, not weathered bone, to gain access to the marrow inside. The third was burning, specifically charring on the posterior cranium, the back of the skull, while the face remained unburned, consistent with a head placed face down on a fire, while the brain was still intact inside it. The fourth was anvil and hammerstone abrasions, the distinctive scraping pattern left when a defleshed bone is smashed between 2 stones to extract marrow. The fifth was pot polish, a fine abrasive sheen found on bone fragments that had been stirred inside a ceramic cooking vessel. The sixth, and most damning, was the systematic absence of vertebrae. Vertebrae are the richest source of marrow in the human body. In the processed assemblages Turner examined, they had been pulverized almost without exception. reduced to fragments too small to identify. In 32 assemblages meeting the minimum threshold of 5 criteria, the number of individuals processed ranged from 1 to 35. The full findings were eventually published in a book co-authored with Jacqueline Turner, Mancorn, released by the University of Utah Press. The title is a direct translation of the Aztec word for a sacred meal of sacrificed human meat cooked with corn. The geographic distribution of the assemblages was not random. Most clustered near Chacoan ceremonial centers. Most dated to the period of Chaco's rise and dominance. Critics spent 2 decades arguing that taphonomic processing did not prove consumption. That a body could be defleshed, dismembered, and cooked without the flesh ever being eaten. That the gap between butchering and eating was wide enough to contain an entirely different explanation. Turner had the distribution maps. He had the bones. He had the 6 criteria checklist. What he did not have was proof of consumption. That proof came in 1997 from a fire pit in southwestern Colorado, and it came from something no archaeologist had ever thought to test before. Near the town of Dolores in southwestern Colorado, excavators uncovered 3 collapsed pit dwellings at a site called Cowboy Wash. The site had been occupied at approximately 1150 AD, consistent with the final decades of the Chaco system. 7 individuals had been processed there. The remains of 4 adults and 1 adolescent were piled in a side chamber. Additional whole bones and fragments lay directly on the floors of the dwellings. Every set of remains bore Turner's full taphonomic signature. But in the ash-filled fire pit at the center of the site, excavators found something else. A coprolite. Desiccated human feces, preserved by the dry desert climate, deposited in the cooled ash of the fire pit just before the site was abandoned. It had been sitting there for 800 years. Richard Marlar was a molecular biologist in the Department of Pathology at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He designed an immunological assay, a test using human-specific antibodies, to detect a single protein, human myoglobin. Myoglobin is found only in skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue. It is not present in blood. It is not present in skin. It is not present in the smooth muscles of the digestive system. There is exactly one way human myoglobin can appear in human feces. One human being must have consumed the skeletal muscle of another. Marlar tested the coprolite. He tested residues scraped from the interior walls of cooking pots found at the same site. Then he tested 20 coprolites from comparable ancestral Puebloan sites of the same period as controls. All 20 controls came back negative. Every sample from Cowboy Wash came back positive. No myoglobin from deer, no myoglobin from rabbit, no myoglobin from any other species present in the regional diet. Only human. The findings were published in Nature, volume 407, in September of 2000. Marlar's conclusion was precise. If you did not eat human beings, this protein would not show up. The debate that had run for 2 decades was over. If this kind of story is what brought you here, subscribe. There are more. Cowboy Wash was abandoned at approximately 1150 AD. That date is not arbitrary. It sits almost exactly at the beginning of the most precisely documented climate event in prehistoric southwestern history. And when the tree rings are read alongside the forensic record, the timing of everything, the cannibalism, the great houses, the roads, the entire Chacoan system, finally makes sense. Trees record everything. Every year of good rain and every year of drought is written into the width of a single growth ring. Dendrochronology, the science of reading those rings, allows researchers to reconstruct rainfall and growing conditions across the American Southwest year by year, going back more than 1,000 years. And what the tree rings show about the decades following 1130 AD is unambiguous. A mega-drought arrived, documented by the Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center and confirmed by multiple independent paleoclimate studies. The drought that began at approximately 1130 AD lasted for roughly 50 years. Its effects across the Four Corners region were severe and compounding. Depressed water tables, eroded floodplains, reduced precipitation season after season, and the steady collapse of agricultural productivity across the entire area that Chaco had spent 2 centuries organizing and feeding from. The timing is exact. Great house construction at Chaco Canyon ceased at approximately 1130 AD, the year the mega-drought begins. Not a decade later, not a generation later. The same moment. Then consider Turner's forensic record alongside that date. The latest skeletal assemblages meeting his full 6 criteria signature cluster tightly in the decades around 1150 AD. After approximately 1180 AD, the signature essentially disappears from the archaeological record. The system that had produced those remains across more than 200 years of Chacoan dominance stopped producing them, abruptly, completely, and permanently. 2 phenomena. 1 timeline. Great house construction and the forensic signature both cease at precisely the moment a 50-year drought would have severed the tribute networks that kept the entire Chacoan system alive. By 1200 AD, depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By approximately 1250 AD, the outlying Chacoan communities were emptying. By approximately 1300 AD, the Four Corners region was effectively empty of dense human habitation. The great houses were not destroyed. They were not burned. They were not attacked. They were abandoned, intact, standing exactly as they had been built, by people who walked away and did not come back. They walked away, but they did not vanish. And the story of where they went had been told accurately for 800 years by the people who remembered. The question is why it took this long for the rest of the world to confirm it. The Ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. Ancient DNA studies completed across the 2010s confirmed genetic continuity between Chacoan skeletal remains and the modern Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Rio Grande Pueblo nations. The migration trail is visible in the archaeological record. Populations moving south and east, following the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado River to mesas and fertile valleys where farming remained possible in a drying climate. These communities never described the builders of Chaco as a separate, lost people. They described them as ancestors. They had been saying so for 800 years. The academic world largely refused to treat that as evidence. It is worth stating clearly, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Rio Grande Pueblo scholars have argued for decades that whatever happened at Chaco happened to their ancestors, perpetrated by an imported system, not by Puebloan culture itself. The DNA, the non-local genetic signals in the elite burials, the filed tooth, and the material culture trail all support that reading precisely. The victims and the descendants are the same people. The real mystery of Chaco Canyon is not what happened to the people who built it. They left behind a trail of bones, DNA, and oral traditions that spelled out the answer for 800 years. The mystery is how a civilization that was never actually lost managed to be called missing for 150. And what else we are still getting wrong about the people who were here before us.